Good morning, good afternoon, class. Today we are going to get into a video lecture in regards to the French Revolution. It's just going to be an introduction to the French Revolution, major points of events leading up to why the revolution breaks out in France in the late 1700s. Yesterday, you guys all watched a 10-minute video on the French Revolution. It was a quick overview from beginning to end. And it's really important now to get into detail of why the revolution actually breaks out and the reasons, because there's going to be multiple reasons why it happens. And the first, I guess, term we should really focus on is the word revolution itself. We've heard it before. We've heard it with the American Revolution. It was a vocab word. We should all know that when there's a revolution, there's some sort of change. People want change in their country because of something that is going on in their country that they don't necessarily like or agree with. So in this case, we are going to focus on what is happening in France, who France is being led by, and how France's government is treating their people, which eventually will lead to an uprising, a rebellion, and a revolution with the French Revolution. So with that being said, I need to discuss the old, I don't want to call it the government, but it's an old political and social class system that made up France before the revolution breaks out. Now, France has an absolute monarch. They have an absolute king who rules, and whatever they say goes. Remember what divine right was. This king or queen will get their power from God. They only answer to God, and they can basically do whatever they want. So the old regime was the name of the old social political system of France, where the people of France are going to be divided up into three large social classes, which they call estates. So I really want you guys to take a look at that political cartoon. I'll come back to that and I'll explain it a little bit more. But the people of France are going to be broken up into three different social classes: the first estate, second estate, and third estate. So what we need to do is take a look at who belongs in each one of those estates and then go a little more detail in why the revolution breaks out. So the first estate is made up of the Roman Catholic Church. And you also call these people clergy members. So whenever you hear the term clergy, always think church officials. Now, the first estate makes up a total population of 1% in France. So roughly there's about 26 million people living in France. 1% of the 26 million belongs to the first estate. So that's only 260,000 people that belong to the first estate, the clergy members, the church officials. But those 260,000 people own or control 10% of all the land in France. Now, 1% isn't very much. 10% doesn't seem very much, but it's a lot of land that's controlled by very few people. Now, the First Estate does a couple things. They will provide education for the poor, and they will also provide relief services to the poor. So they do contribute about 2% of their overall income to the government. So if you really want to call that a tax, we can call it a tax, but more or less it's like a donation that they give to the government, a 2% per year donation. So once again, quick recap: First Estate, made up of clergy members or church officials. They control or own 10% of the land, and they make up 1% of the total population. The second estate. Now, the second estate are the rich nobles. They are the nobility. Now, the only way that you can be a part of nobility is to be born into that noble family. It's through the family name. It is through blood. You cannot just be an everyday person who wants to be a noble. It doesn't work that way. And the second estate makes up 2% of the total population, but they own or control 20% of the land. So, once again, very few people that control lots and lots of land. These are pretty wealthy people. They're rich. They have money. They have that noble name. And the worst part is they don't pay any taxes. They make a lot of money. They have a lot of money, but they pay zero taxes. And hopefully, you guys can understand how that can become a problem. Moving on to the third estate. Now, the third estate is everyone else. The third estate is made up of about 97% of the population in France. So out of 26 million people, the third estate makes up 25,220,000 of the 26 million. That's a lot of people. And unfortunately for the third estate, they are the ones that are burdened with all the taxes. They are forced to pay heavy, heavy taxes on everything. If it's land, if it's housing, if it's basic goods, if it's clothing, whatever it is, they are taxed the most out of everyone. Now, the third estate, you need to understand this, and this is very important. The third estate is broken up into three different groups within the third estate. Now, I'm going to talk about each one of them, but you guys need to really pay attention and please be taking notes on each one of these. So the first group that belongs to the third estate is known as the bourgeoisie. And they are actually middle class to upper class citizens. They have money. They have great jobs. They have money. But the only difference between them and the second estate is that they are not born into that noble family. They don't have the noble blood. So they are considered to be in the third estate. Bad thing about that is that they are responsible for paying heavy, heavy taxes. So hopefully we can see the connection here. Bourgeoisie is just as rich as the second estate, but the second estate doesn't have to pay anything when it comes to taxes, and the bourgeoisie are heavily, heavily taxed. So if you are a part of this bourgeoisie group, you look at other citizens that are in like the first and second estate, and you start to think things are very unfair because it is. There should be no difference between you and another person based off of a family name or how much money you have. But that was not the case in France. The second group of people that belonged to the third estate was known as the city workers. And these are people that, like it says, they work in the cities. They work any job that they can get in the city, if it's building things, if it's an apprentice, a laborer, domestic servant. Now, the problem with city workers is that they work for very low wages. They're willing to work for lower wages to actually just get a job. So the problem with that is they're paid very low wages, and the money that they do make, it's almost impossible for them to survive off of that paycheck or that money that they're receiving from their job. And a lot of these city workers will lose their jobs and they don't have any money to take care of themselves or even their families. So it becomes a very big problem. The third group and last group that belongs to the third estate, of course, are the peasants. And these are people that work on the farms. And the peasants consist of 80% of the total population of people living in France. And unfortunately for the peasants, they are going to pay almost half of their income, half of what they make in taxes to the nobles, to the church, to the king. So once again, this whole idea of the old regime, this class system, it is very, very unfair. And the third estate is getting to the point where they need to do something about it because their life living in France is not good at all. So just to give you a visual, I like to look at visuals or pictures to understand things. So what I have on this slide is a graph that shows the three different estates. And then there's two different colors. The blue represents the population of that social class, and then the green represents the percentage of land that that estate owns or controls. So it's really important, guys, for us to understand these numbers. 26 million people live in France. And of the 26 million, 97% of them belong to the third estate. Almost 21 million of the 26 are the poorest of the poor, the peasants, the ones that are heavily, heavily taxed. So now I'm hoping that we can all see that this is a big, big problem. You have rich people, or actually I shouldn't say very few. You have rich people that live in France. They don't pay any taxes. And then you have lots and lots and lots of poor people, and they are responsible for paying all of the taxes. So I'm hoping that we all see that this is a very, very, very unfair class system. Now, besides the unfair class system of the old regime, France is suffering some major economic troubles. They are heavily, heavily taxing the third estate. And the third estate, which is the bourgeoisie, the city workers, the peasants, it's almost impossible for the third estate to get by. It's almost impossible for the third estate to make any sort of profit because all of their money is being paid in taxes and they just can't get by. Now, on top of heavy taxes, the cost of living in France increases. So the prices of basic necessities, food, shelter, clothing, the stuff that you need to survive from day to day, all those prices of those goods are going to go up. Now the problem is that people either don't have a job and aren't making any money, or the job that they do have, they're getting paid very, very low wages. So once again, it is almost impossible for people to survive with the basic necessities because they can't afford anything. Another problem is bad weather. Now, when I say bad weather, you're probably thinking, well, what does that have to do with economic troubles that are going on in France? It has everything to do with the harvesting of crops and food. If their weather is bad, if it's too hot, if it's too cold, if there's a drought, whatever it is, that means not as much crops are being produced. And the crops that are being produced, those are being sold at the stores at a very, very high price because there's very, very low supply, but a very high demand. And whenever that happens, people charge goods at a very, very high price because they have to make some sort of money. Now, really, the food that we're going to, or the crop, excuse me, that we're going to focus on are grains. And grains are obviously used to make bread. And bread is eaten every single day in France. And that's like the food of choice in France. And the problem is that the prices of bread go way up. And people either aren't working or the job that they do have aren't paying them good wages and they can't afford, which means not only do they starve, but their families starve. So this is just one more thing that's upsetting the citizens of France. When I say the citizens, I'm referring to the third estate because remember, those are the people that are being treated unfairly. They're not being treated as equals to the first or second estate. So that becomes a very, very big problem. And last but not least, there's very weak leadership in France. I mentioned before that France is under an absolute monarch. The king at the time is Louis the 16th, and his wife is Queen Elizabeth, or excuse me, Queen Marie Antoinette. They're very young. Louis the 16th takes over the throne when he is 19, and Marie Antoinette was 18. And he's very young, he's very immature, he does not know how to run a country. So it's really important for us to understand that because of the weak leadership, that's going to put France into even a further debt or economic crisis. Not only does France have weak leadership, but hopefully we all remember that France has been fighting in several wars. The French and Indian War in North America, where France fought against the colonists and the British, losing that war. They also helped the colonists years later fight against the British in the Revolutionary War. Well, all these wars that France is fighting in, you got to understand, cost lots and lots of money. So that pushes France further into debt because of them participating and fighting in these wars. I will talk a little bit about it later, but I've already mentioned Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI being weak leaders, but they also are spending money extravagantly. They're buying luxurious items and goods. They like to have nice, expensive things, palaces, jewelry, gowns, clothing. And they really worry and focus just on themselves and their family, and they don't take care of the citizens of France. So that also becomes a very big problem. Now, these are events leading up to the French Revolution, and I've mentioned all of them before. And I know when you're writing your notes, some of us will just write down the bullet points, but I don't want you just to write down the bullet points. I need you to really listen to this lecture, and I need you to add points, or excuse me, notes to the bullet points that you see on the screen. Because remember, I add a lot more to these video lectures than what you just see on the bullet points on the slides presentation. So let's talk about the Enlightenment ideas. We know that the Enlightenment started in France in the 1700s. We know what these Enlightenment ideas were all about. You have all these different Enlightenment philosophers, and each one of them have their ideas and their opinions, and they start writing their ideas and their opinions down in books, and they publish these books. And when you read a book and you like a book, what do? You always tell someone about it. And then all these Enlightenment ideas start spreading around France. They start spreading around Europe. They make their way to North America, which causes the Revolutionary War. So what ends up happening is France starts to really focus on these Enlightenment ideas. And they realize that their government is not treating them and their citizens the way they should be. And they really look at what happened here in the United States with the Revolutionary War, and they almost look at that as an influence. It actually is an influence, and it's inspiration. They thought if the colonists could beat the British and become independent of the British and make their lives better, then they could too. And that's exactly what happens. The Third Estate is very upset and fed up with the French government, and they want change. They want revolution. They want a better life for themselves and their families. I mentioned the economic troubles in the previous slide, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But honestly, and the first part of this lecture was on the old regime, but it was a very unfair class system. And it benefited the first and second estate and left everything else up to the third estate. And it really treated the third estate unfairly and unequally to the first two. And then, of course, the weak leadership. If you had a strong leader in your country, that person or persons would not allow this to happen in their country. They would take care of their citizens. They would look at their citizens as being equals and protecting the rights of their citizens. But we all know that's not the case in France during this time period. So once again, you guys please hit pause, rewind, listen to the video lecture again if you need to, but make sure that you are writing down all of these notes. Not only the notes that are on the screen, but once again, the additional notes that I give in the video lectures. You will be able to use these notes for your quiz that's going to be on Friday. So the better notes that you take, obviously, the better results you are going to get on your quiz.